Okay, well, let's start with the basic question to make sure that our listeners will understand what it is exactly. What is fatigue, Clinton?
Right. So I get asked this a lot. What is fatigue? So in my world, the area that I work in, I work with a very specific type of fatigue that I refer to as sleep-related fatigue. That is, fatigue is a symptom of sleep-related factors. Now, if you think about how the term fatigue can be used, at least in the English language, it can be used to describe a number of different states. One is, as I mentioned, sleep-related fatigue, which is um, the same thing as saying sleepiness. And it goes from very low level of sleepiness, that is a very low level of fatigue, all the way to a very high level of fatigue or sleepiness where it's almost impossible to stay awake. It's important to distinguish this type of fatigue from other essentially sources of fatigue. So we will often talk about physical fatigue and mental fatigue. Physical fatigue results from using your body intensely for a short period of time, like going to the gym and working out, or using it constantly for a long period of time. After using it intensely for a short period of time, or just consistently for a long period of time, people will often say, I feel fatigued. But just because you've worked out for an hour doesn't mean you're going to fall asleep more quickly. So it's a different type of fatigue that I work in, and that most of the transportation industries are interested in managing as well. The other one it often gets mixed up with is what I refer to as mental fatigue. So similar to physical fatigue, you can become mentally fatigued after essentially using your brain power very intensely, like trying to deal with an emergency situation, and for a short period of time, or by using essentially your brain power for a long period of time. Say studying for an exam for 2 to 3 hours in a row, you might say that afterwards, I feel fatigued. But just because you've studied for 2 or 3 hours doesn't mean you're going to fall asleep more quickly. So there are different types of fatigue in that they come from different sources. And it's really important to understand the different types of fatigue, because if they're coming from different sources, you need to try different solutions for each type of fatigue, right? So the solution for physical fatigue, rest your body. Doesn't necessarily need sleep. Sleep will help for sure, but rest. Mental fatigue, well, give your brain a rest. Go and do a different task for a little while. Let your brain rest and come back to it. Again, sleep will help, but it's not necessary for it. Sleep-related fatigue, you have to address the sleep factors that resulted in the fatigue. Okay? We often talk about a sleep debt. A sleep debt is the lack of the right quantity of sleep over a period of time. You build up a large sleep debt and you can become fatigued. So that's my definition of fatigue.
Very well. Um, how is fatigue impacting the functional capacity, health and safety, and productivity of the railroaders, Clinton?
Yeah. So if you think of fatigue as a symptom of sleep issues, insufficient sleep quality or quantity, or improperly timed sleep, then you can think of all of these negative outcomes from it, right? So really, being fatigued every now and then, well, it's not terrible from a health perspective, but experiencing the poor sleep quality or quantity that results in the fatigue over a long period of time can result in some pretty significant illnesses. So health-wise, there's great research that supports a really strong link between some pretty bad conditions like diabetes, cardiovascular problems, like heart attack, stroke, digestive problems, and even some cancers. The risk of them can increase if you're experiencing poor sleep and therefore fatigue over long periods of time. Okay? So that's health. Now, fatigue does have a significant impact on safety in the short term. Now, what we see is that the more fatigued you are, and remember we're talking about sleep-related fatigue here, the more fatigued you are, the greater the likelihood you'll have a slowed down reaction time. So if you're thinking of people working within the railroad industry, if there's an emergency situation that arises, you only have a matter of a couple of seconds to react and to do something quickly, like get the brakes on really fast or throttle down, right? A matter of a couple of seconds in railway terms can mean a pretty big distance, especially with long, heavy trains. So reaction time can be affected by it, and that's really important in railway operations. Things like short-term memory or working memory, the ability to keep information in your head and work with it, is often referred to as working or short-term memory. And we tend to forget things in the short term when we're more fatigued. So maybe operators might be driving a train and they initially remember to look for a mile marker. But if you're fatigued, you might forget to look for that mile marker. If you pass that mile marker, you could then end up in a situation where your train is, say, too close to a crossing, too close to a switch perhaps, and going too fast. And that, of course, can result in derailments or other types of accidents. We also see changes in your ability to pay attention. Now, back when I was with the Transportation Safety Board, we would see decreases in operators' ability to stay focused on the task of driving a train. So again, if they're looking for specific mile markers, specific signage, if you're fatigued, it's really hard to pay attention to that task, hard to stay focused on it. So you might drive past a sign without even realizing it. And signage is critical in railway operations. You have to know the signage to know where you are and to know how to handle that train. And again, missing one single sign can result in some pretty significant accidents and incidents. We also see things like changes in ability to make good decisions, judgment, as well as reaction time and ability to pay attention and memory are also negative outcomes, or happen to become negative outcomes because of fatigue. Now, so that's health, safety. Now, when we refer to the functional capacity, what we're referring to here is, as people, we play multiple roles, right? We have these capacities to be good family members, good community people, good workers. So this all is what is encompassed by functional capacity. Now, if you're fatigued and say you've got a short-term working memory problems, ability to pay attention, or another thing we see in fatigued people is mood decreases. We're more somber, sometimes we're angrier, sometimes we cry more. And as well, if you feel fatigued, you don't have the energy to function as a contributing member to society, to your community, to your family, or even as a good worker. So that's what we refer to as functional capacity. And fatigue affects all of these components, right? So functional capacity, health, safety, productivity as well, sort of outside of the railway world. If you're, say, working in a manufacturing plant, and your reaction time is slow and your ability to pay attention is slow, it might make it more difficult for you to do your job in general. You won't be able to make as much of whatever you're making, as many widgets. So productivity can be reduced as well. Yeah.
Do you feel that the workers in the rail industry are over fatigued than compared to other workers in other industries?
Well, had you asked me that 2 years ago, I would have said yes, but for one reason. We now have a new set of rules that is guiding how operating employees, at least within the railway industry, can work. They were recently published. They're called the Duty and Rest Period Rules. And when they come into effect, now the problem is it's going to take years before they come into effect, but when they come into effect, I'm hoping to see less fatigue. So they won't be as overly fatigued, right? 2 years ago, there was no sign that these rules would be published, and I would say for sure that fatigue is undermanaged in railway operations, which of course creates more fatigued people who are at greater risk of health, safety, productivity, and functional capacity risks. So we're transitioning. I'm hoping it's going to get better, but right now it's probably about the same as it was a couple of years ago. In that, yes, I think fatigue is still a problem within railway operations.
Well, you're answering the third question I had. So you answered all the questions. Anything else you would like to add that you feel it's important?
Well, we touched on functional capacity. Um, One thing, so here's one challenge that I'm seeing. So, years and years ago when I started doing this work, my impression was that a huge problem at the management level, and a little bit of a problem at the employee level. Now, what we've seen is that it's probably a problem at both levels equally, right? So management, and a lot of that is because people don't understand all of the risks that are involved with fatigue. Right? There's organizational risk, but there's personal risks as well. So one of the things that I like to get out there is that, sure, when you're managing fatigue in an operational context, that is, say your managers say this is how you have to work now. You can't work, super long hours, and we're going to reduce the number of shifts you get, etc. Um, what they're failing to do is show you all of the personal benefits you can get out of managing fatigue a little bit differently. And this is a critical piece of the puzzle, because if we're asking people to do things differently, then management really has to give us something in return, right? Like, what are we getting? If you want us to give up our days off to manage our sleep rather than be with family, well, what are we going to get in return here, right? And one of the things that management really has to talk about is better quality of life, increased health, and if the new duty rest and rest period rules that are coming out across all industries are written correctly, you should end up with actually more time with family, right? More time to do your own things. It does often mean a little less money, but what you're getting is potentially a longer life, happier life, safer life, and more productive life. So, an emphasis on both sides of that fatigue management puzzle. Individuals and management have to work together here to do it properly. Yeah.
So in brief, we have to be patient before this regulation is enforced and working on the field, and that people get used to it, and the hour of services in the rail industry, which is very interesting. Listen, Clinton, it's been fantastic.